Thank you, thank you. The following is one of my voiceover demos. If you're a voiceover artist and you would like to advertise one of your demos on my podcast, please send an MP3 to thedrill12, all one word, at gmail.com. That's thedrill12 at gmail.com. Back in a minute.
Americans love scenery. We want to see it all, from one coast to the next, Mount Rushmore down to the Everglades. So hop into a Chevy Malibu and take the scenic route. It's the car you knew America could build. There's a place where people count on friendships they can trace back generations, where they can count on the same stool at the coffee shop waiting for them every morning. This place is called Glen Ellen, and you can find it in every bottle of Glen Ellen wine. This is craft brewed Herman Joseph's, the smoothest, easiest drinking specialty beer in the entire solar system. And I believe you'll find drinkable in the dictionary right after don't order a beer you can't drink. Zoingo! Boingo! The freestyle pogo with more boing, more bounce. Bounce further, bounce higher with Zoingo Boingo. To see what makes Arrowhead Mountain Spring water different from those other waters, you have to go back to the source. And with Arrowhead, that means going back a little farther and longer than most. Between security challenged and security strengthened, there's one important word: how. And it is the how that makes all the difference to our nation and our world. Lockheed Martin. We never forget who we're working for. What makes Kraft singles so good? 2 out of every 3 kids don't get the recommended amount of calcium. But with Kraft singles, they get a good source of calcium and the taste they love. Kraft singles. Magic every single time. Throw boring overboard with a new real meal from Long John Silver's. A meal worthy of a plate, just $4.99. Only at Long John Silver's. We may not all be geniuses, but we can all do something smart. Introducing the Hyundai 199 Sonata Lease. It's a smart deal on a really smart car.
Because 1 in 10 people are gay. 1 in 9 people are left-handed. They say they're born that way, but it's a choice. Put the pen in the other hand, freak show. So, looking for attention for your weirdo left-handed lifestyle. Left-handed people say they want to marry other left-handed people now. What hand do I put the ring on? Is this legal? Can I marry a unicorn? I don't fucking know. I worked with a guy who was left-handed. I went into work one day. The mouse was on the wrong side of the keyboard. I fucking threw up. I had to go home, okay? All polar bears are left-handed. That shit's on the internet. If it isn't, put it on right now. All polar bears left-handed. Osama bin Laden was left-handed. Left-handed people are fucking polar bear terrorists. Why are we not dealing with this shit? And they're like, Simon, what does it matter to you if left-handed people want to marry other left-handed people? How does that affect you, the common, normal, right-handed person who is not an abomination in the eyes of the Lord? Well, what you don't understand is that if left-handed people are allowed to marry left-handed people, they're going to raise their fucking kids left-handed. Yeah. And then shit's going to change for the norms. All of a sudden, 20, 30 years now, you're shaking hands with the wrong hand. Is this hello or goodbye? I don't know. I pledge allegiance to backwards land. What is going on? Why am I driving on the wrong side of the road now? Because you didn't fucking vote. That's why you didn't fucking vote. Left-handed people say they want equal rights. Well, they're called rights, not lefts, not job. So stop trying to get us to sign up to your alternative fucking lifestyle. I need a special kind of can opener. Get up.
Good morning. It's Thursday, Bad News Thursday, October the 3rd, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer, the patriotic song of the day, and Varney and Company, we will have the patriotic shorts, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 Strategies of War, and Bad News. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
need help for these people.
Thank
They're
you.
suffering
Now,
from
Barney and
Hurricane
Company.
Helene. If we could spend $150 billion of taxpayer dollars for illegal aliens, we could certainly help them.
Good point. Great show, everybody. Thank you so much. Have a good day. We'll see you again tomorrow morning. Company picks it up. Stu, take it away.
Good morning, Maria, and good morning, everyone. The president tells Israel, don't attack Iran's nuclear facilities. Not sure Netanyahu is listening. He is going to respond to Iran's ballistic missile attack earlier this week, but we don't know how or when. High anxiety reigns. Day 3 of the port strike. It's a political dilemma. Both Biden and Harris support the strike and will not intervene to stop it. How long will they keep that up if shortages develop right before the election? To the markets. Many investors on the sidelines waiting for tomorrow morning's jobs report. The Dow Industrials down maybe 150 points, NASDAQ down about 90. Red ink on the left-hand side of the screen. Interest rates are up a little. The yield on the 10-year Treasury goes to 3.82%. And the yield on the 2-year moving up almost to 370. You're at 368. Yields up in Treasuries. Bitcoin right around $60,000, 60,400. Oil at $71 a barrel. Despite the extreme tension in the Mideast, oil has not rallied that much. Gas $3.19 a gallon for regular, and diesel is $3.57. On the show today, the president visits the hurricane damage. Asheville, the center of the devastation. FEMA has a problem. Secretary Mayorkas says the agency's running out of money. Turns out they took $650 million out of their budget and spent it on migrants. OpenAI takes in over $6 billion. Microsoft and Nvidia, big investors. That gives the company a value of $157 billion, just like that. We'll try to figure out what they're going to do with all that money. It is Thursday, October 3rd, 2024. Varney & Company is about...
And for those of you that are Democrats out there, then the question you're going to be asking is, why did the administration take all the $650 million away from FEMA to give to migrants, so-called migrants, actually illegal immigrants, instead of doing something to abate climate change? For instance, climate change is supposed to be an existential threat, but the invasion of illegal aliens is not, right? So if in 10 years the whole planet is going to be dead, you would think that the administration would have a sense of urgency. And if they're going to rob Peter to pay Paul, that the Paul they're going to pay is climate change instead of giving it to illegal immigrants. And if they're not going to go ahead and do anything about climate change, why should you bother to vote for them? Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the election corner.
If what is happening with the people in Georgia, Florida, Tennessee, North Carolina with this hurricane doesn't open y'all's eyes and make y'all realize that the people that run this country don't give a fuck about us, I don't know what the fuck will. Because who's helping these people? Regular, degular people. People that are struggling are giving their last to help these people. Where's our government? Where's our president? Probably somewhere taking a fucking nap. Where's the vice president? Nowhere to be fucking found. You can say whatever you want about Trump. You can say he's only doing it to make himself look good. Oh, well, he's fucking doing it. He's the only one out here fucking doing it. The man done brought his ass to Georgia. The man done started a fucking GoFundMe to help these people. At least he's doing something. You can't say that about Joe and Kamala, whatever the fucking lady name is. This is insane. Y'all can send like $40 billion to another country, but you can't give $1 billion to your people? That's crazy. This country is fucked.
Stop right now.
And that was the political corner. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Patriotic Short.
This sheriff was asked to apologize for this, chose to resign instead.
Darren Carter,
You think men like these are afraid of an uneducated, 125-pound punk like you that's never won a fair fight in your life and holds your gun sideways? Young man, I'll meet you on solid ground anytime, anywhere, light or heavy. Makes no difference to me. You won't walk away. And the convicts in jail, most of those men are good people who just found themselves crossed with the law. They're not evil, and they don't respect you or any punk like you. They'll toss you around like a rag doll. Take a close look behind me. Standing next to every cop is a leader of our black community. This is not about race. It's about right versus wrong. One last message to the gremlins. You don't like the things I've told you tonight? I got one thing to say. I'm easy to find.
And that was the Patriotic Short. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, about 5 minutes of motivation.
What do you do when it seems like suffering won't stop? What do you do when it feels like your weaknesses continue to worsen? Maybe you've taken a knockdown concerning your finances lately. You're laying on the mat, gasping, and you don't know what you're going to do. Maybe it's with your kids, maybe with your marriage, maybe with your health, maybe some other arena of life. You didn't see it coming, and you feel like you've been knocked down. But we're not destroyed. The last chapter of your story has not been written yet. The fact that you're here today is a testament to the fact that whatever you're up against hasn't been able to destroy you.
Don't give in. Don't be like everybody else. Don't give up. Don't settle because things are hard.
Now, will it be turbulent? Yes. Will it be easy? No. Will I make a lot of mistakes? Yes. Will I get hurt? Yes. Pain is everywhere. Most people spend their life not wanting to deal with the pain of rejection, the pain of defeat, the pain of losing, the pain of failure, the pain. That's called life. Life is full of pain, but there's no gain without pain.
We are being pressed from every side by troubles, but we're not crushed. We're not boxed in. We're not left without a way out. We are not cornered. So the problems are coming in from every angle, but there is always a way of escape.
You want me to tell you to give up? Huh? You want me to tell you to quit? It's all right to give up. It's all right to surrender. That's what you want me to say? I can't tell you that. But what I can tell you is this, that I did it, and I got here from my mind, and I envisioned it. I saw myself when I was still homeless, when I was still a high school dropout, when I was sleeping in abandoned buildings. I saw myself one day being where I am right now. I don't care where you are. Use what you got to get what you want. Use your mind. Use your vision. Use your dream. I dreamed my way out the hood. I dreamed my way out. And then I saw it. And then I would get up every day and I would grind hard. You gotta have a why. You gotta have a reason for why you do what you do. If you don't know what your why is and your why isn't strong, you're gonna get knocked out every single day. But when you know what your why is, you can make it. You've got to activate the thinker in you. Don't allow your emotions to control you. We are emotional, but you want to begin to discipline your emotion. If you don't discipline and contain your emotions, they will use you. What if you lose? What if you fail? What if things don't work out? So what? It's not about the goals that you reach. It's about what you become in the process. That's what it's about. 50% of winning is showing up for the fight. The fight is half over when you show up. You will never win a fight you don't show up for. I'm showing up for the fight. Here I am, ready for duty. I'm going to face this head on and let the chips fall where they may.
Every one of my successes is stacked on top of failures. The joy is not in the success. The joy is in trying. The joy is in the process. That I'm going to keep working. I'm going to keep going at it. See, failure is forming my future. Failure is just another peg in the ladder for me to go higher.
It's been rough. It's been hard. But I made up in my mind that I will get a reward for the pain that I go through. You will not stop me. It's hard. I know it's hard, but do it hard.
The greatest test is in transition. If you are being tested, you are in transition.
And you got to get it in your brain that where you are right now is not the end. It's just a transition. Stop letting stuff derail you. Stop getting stuck. Every time life don't go your way, stop quitting. Stop giving up. Keep fighting in the midst of the struggle. Keep fighting. Keep thinking positive. You only lose when you quit. You got to put up the dukes, baby. And you got to be willing to fight that thing out. If you would be willing to fight your way through this battle, fight your way through cancer, fight your way through that academic struggle, fight your way through divorce, fight your way through that singing career, fight your way through boxing, fight your way through football. I'm telling you, at the end of the fight is going to come victory. Recycle your pain. You can decide the shape, the form. You can decide the product that comes from your pain.
And maybe you've been knocked down in your life and it seems like, hey, the fight is over. It is not over if you've been knocked down. It's only over if you quit. We may be knocked down, but we're never knocked out. We get up again and we keep going. If you make the decision to get up one more time, I'm telling you, you will win the fight.
And that was a little bit of motivation. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, a little bit of about 5 minutes of meditation. And that was a little bit of meditation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Daily Stoic.
The best retreat is in here, not out there. People seek retreats for themselves in the country, by the sea, or in the mountains. You are very much in the habit of yearning for those same things, but this is entirely the trait of a base person, when you can at any moment find such a retreat in yourself. For nowhere can you find a more peaceful and less busy retreat than in your own soul, especially if on close inspection it is filled with ease, which I say is nothing more than being well ordered. Treat yourself often to this retreat and be renewed. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations 4.3.1. Do you have a vacation coming up? Are you looking forward to the weekend so you can have some peace and quiet? Maybe, you think, after things settle down or after I get this over with. But how often has that ever actually worked? The Zen meditation teacher John Kabat-Zinn coined a famous expression, wherever you go, there you are. We can find a retreat at any time by looking inward. We can sit with our eyes closed and feel our breath go in and out. We can turn on some music and tune out the world. We can turn off technology or shut off those rampant thoughts in our head. That will provide us peace. Nothing else.
And that was the Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
What's the soul? The soul is not so much one element among many. So I've got, various elements, and soul is one of them. Rather, soul is the all-embracing or all-grounding reality. Soul includes, if you want, the whole of my life. The whole of my life in relation to God. Soul is not some little thing inside. Rather, soul is that which contains the whole of me. If the soul is rightly ordered, it can handle anything. Worldly success or worldly failure. Popularity, unpopularity. Honor, dishonor. Rightly ordered, the soul can handle all of those situations. Disordered, it can handle nothing. Whether you have honor or dishonor, whether you have health or sickness, whether they love you or hate you, if the soul is disordered, or if you've lost your soul, then none of those situations will benefit you. Profits a man nothing to gain the whole world if he's lost his soul.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Thank you. Now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, what objectivity and the study of philosophy require is not an open mind, but an active mind, a mind able and eagerly willing to examine ideas, but to examine them critically, unquote. This was Ayn Rand, philosophical detection from Philosophy Who Needs It. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the 33 strategies of war.
During World War II, when the Germans bombed London, psychologists noted that when the bombing was frequent and somewhat regular, the people of the city became numb to it. They grew accustomed to the noise, discomfort, and carnage. But when the bombing was irregular and sporadic, fear became terror. It was much harder to deal with the uncertainty of when the next one would land. It is a law of war and strategy that in the search for an advantage, anything will be tried and tested. And so it is that groups and individuals, seeing the immense power that terror can have over humans, have found a way to use terror as a strategy. People are crafty, resourceful, and adaptable creatures. The way to paralyze their will and destroy their capacity to think straight is to consciously create uncertainty, confusion, and an unmanageable fear. Such strategic terror can take the form of exemplary acts of destruction. The masters of this art were the Mongols. They would level a few cities here and there in as horrible a manner as possible. The terrifying legend of the Mongol horde spread quickly. At its very approach to a city, panic would ensue as the inhabitants could only imagine the worst. More often than not, the city would surrender without a fight, the Mongols' goal all along. A relatively small army far from home, they could not afford long sieges or protracted wars. This strategic terror can also be used for political purposes, to hold a group or nation together. In 1792, the French Revolution was spinning out of control. Foreign armies were on the verge of invading France. The country was hopelessly factionalized. The radicals, led by Robespierre, confronted this threat by initiating a war against the moderates, the Reign of Terror. Accused of counter-revolution, thousands were sent to the guillotine. No one knew who would be next. Although the radicals were relatively small in number, by creating such uncertainty and fear, they were able to paralyze their opponent's will. Paradoxically, the Reign of Terror, which gives us the first recorded instance of the use of the words terrorism and terrorist, produced a degree of stability. Although terror as a strategy can be employed by large armies and indeed whole states, it is most effectively practiced by those small in number. The reason is simple. The use of terror usually requires a willingness to kill innocent civilians in the name of a greater good and for a strategic purpose. For centuries, with a few notable exceptions such as the Mongols, military leaders were unwilling to go so far. Meanwhile, a state that inflicted mass terror on its own populace would unleash demons and create a chaos it might find hard to control. But small groups have no such problems. Being so few in number, they cannot hope to wage a conventional war or even a guerrilla campaign. Terror is their strategy of last resort. Taking on a much larger enemy, they are often desperate, and they have a cause to which they are utterly committed. Ethical considerations pale in comparison, and creating chaos is part of their strategy. Terrorism was limited for many centuries by its tools: the sword, the knife, the gun, all agents of individual killing. Then, in the 19th century, a single campaign produced a radical innovation, giving birth to terrorism as we know it today. In the late 1870s, a group of Russian radicals, mostly from the intelligentsia, had been agitating for a peasant-led revolution. Eventually, they realized that their cause was hopeless. The peasants were unprepared to take this kind of action, and more important, the Tsarist regime and its repressive forces were far too powerful. Tsar Alexander II had recently initiated what became known as the White Terror, a brutal crackdown on any form of dissidence. It was almost impossible for the radicals to operate in the open, let alone spread their influence. Yet if they did nothing, the Tsar's strength would only grow. And so from among these radicals, a group emerged bent on waging a terrorist war. They called themselves Narodnaya Volya, or People's Will. To keep their organization clandestine, they kept it small. They dressed inconspicuously, melting into the crowd, and they began to make bombs. Once they had assassinated a number of government ministers, the Tsar became a virtual prisoner in his palace. Deranged with the desire to hunt the terrorists down, he directed all of his energies toward this goal, with the result that much of his administration became dysfunctional. In 1880, the radicals were able to explode a bomb in the Winter Palace, the Tsar's residence in St. Petersburg. Then, finally, the following year, another bomb killed Alexander himself. The government naturally responded with repression still harsher than the policy already in place, erecting a virtual police state. In spite of this, in 1888, Alexander Ulyanov, the brother of Vladimir Lenin and a member of Narodnaya Volya, nearly succeeded in killing Alexander's successor, Tsar Alexander III. The capture and execution of Ulyanov brought the activities of Narodnaya Volya to a close, but the group had already begun to inspire a wave of terrorist strikes internationally, including
the anarchist assassination of the American presidents James A. Garfield in 1881 and William McKinley in 1901. And with Narodnaya, all the elements of modern terrorism are in place. The group thought bombs better than guns, being more dramatic and more frightening. They believed that if they killed enough ministers of the government, extending upward to the Tsar himself, the regime would either collapse or go to extremes to try to defend itself. That repressive reaction, though, would in the long run play into the radicals' hands, fomenting a discontent that would eventually spark a revolution. Meanwhile, the bombing campaign would win the group coverage in the press, indirectly publicizing their cause to sympathizers around the world. They called this the propaganda of the deed.
And that was the 33 strategies of war. Back in a minute. Thank you. If you're a Democrat, you should vote Republican because today's society increasingly divests itself of the negativity of the other or the foreign. The process of globalization accelerates the dissolution of borders and distinctions. Yet, the depletion of negativity should not be equated with the disappearance of violence, since along with the violence of negativity, there's a violence of positivity, which is wielded without enmity or domination. Violence isn't merely an excess of negativity. It can also be an excess of positivity. The accumulation of the positive, which manifests as overachievement, overproduction, overcommunication, hyperattention, and hyperactivity. The violence of positivity is possibly even more disastrous than that of negativity because it is neither visible nor evident, and it evades immunological defense because of its positivity. Infection, invasion, and infiltration, which are characteristic of the violence of negativity, now give way to infarction. Back in a minute. Thank you. Let me turn this off. Okay, so one of the big scandals, and I was just listening to John Cobelt talking about this, big scandals, the scandal du jour is that the government, that FEMA doesn't have any money to for the people in North Carolina and other states affected by the hurricane, because apparently they've been sending hundreds of millions of dollars to the illegal aliens and for resettlement of illegal aliens. And so my issue is here for you Democrats is $600 million. You're going to redirect that money. Why wouldn't they redirect it towards single payer? Why wouldn't they redirect that money towards reducing climate change or reducing the probability of climate change? Because that's supposed to be happening in 10 years. So why are they wasting money giving it for the resettlement of illegal aliens? Why would they do that? I would think that every Democrat in this country would be up in arms, jumping up and down, screaming and yelling at the Biden administration about the fact that they're wasting money, they're wasting time, they're wasting energy. They could be doing all kinds of good things for the planet and for the United States, and instead they're dithering. They're wasting time, money, and energy. Back in a minute. Thank you. So Vice President Harris is very, very, very unpopular. And she's so unpopular that the firefighters union, the same union that backed President Biden in 2020, won't bother to back her this year. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now a little bit of Tim Walz, I guess when he was governor.
We have more refugees per capita than any other state. That's not just morally a good thing. It's our economic and cultural future.
So there he is bragging about how many refugees that he has in the state of Minnesota. Again, those refugees represent money, time, and energy that's going to be diverted from climate change and single payer. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Chapter 9 of Bad News.
Chapter 9, A Rich Debate Within the Black Community. The moral panic around race, sweeping across America's largest and most influential newsrooms, reached fever pitch in the spring and summer of 2020. But there's little sign that it's abating, and it's having a deep impact on the practice of journalism. The very idea of objectivity, one of the most central tenets of journalism, has come under deep scrutiny and even been cast as, you guessed it, racist, with headlines like "Objectivity is a privilege afforded to white journalists," and "Objectivity in journalism perpetuates racism," and "Journalism is masking racism behind the lie of objectivity," proliferating throughout the summer and fall of 2020. The 60 Minutes correspondent Wesley Lowery made a more subtle case in an op-ed in the Times entitled "A Reckoning Over Objectivity Led by Black Journalists," in which he wrote that Black journalists are pushing for a paradigm shift in newsrooms across America. Conversations about objectivity, rather than happening in a virtuous vacuum, habitually focus on predicting whether a given sentence, opening paragraph, or entire article will appear objective to a theoretical reader who is invariably assumed to be white, wrote Lowery. He proposed an alternative. Instead of promising our readers that we will never, on any platform, betray a single personal bias, submitting ourselves to a life sentence of public thoughtlessness, a better pledge would be an assurance that we will devote ourselves to accuracy, that we will diligently seek out the perspectives of those with whom we personally may be inclined to disagree, and that we will be just as sure to ask hard questions of those with whom we're inclined to agree. This is a good ideal. The problem is, this ideal that Lowery suggests we replace objectivity with is itself objectivity. When journalists promise to be objective, we're not promising to never feel a certain way about a subject. We're promising to be aware of those feelings and to do our best to counteract them in our reporting. We aren't promising never to betray a personal bias, but rather promising to do exactly what Lowery rightly suggests: challenge our personal biases by seeking out others who disagree with us, just as the editors who procured the Tom Cotton op-ed did. Lowery does not agree. The journalists, the black journalists who pushed back most forcefully on the Cotton op-ed essay, were not calling for an end to public discourse or the censorship of opinions they disliked. They were responding to the particularly poor handling of a particularly outlandish case during a particularly sensitive moment, he wrote. But as we saw in the previous chapter, this just isn't true. The op-ed was handled as every other one is, with the highest standards of editing and fact-checking. Its failure was in hewing to the reigning moral sensibility of the day. As Lowery put it in a tweet, American View from Nowhere objectivity-obsessed both sides journalism is a failed experiment. We need to rebuild our industry as one that operates from a place of moral clarity. And this dichotomy separating objectivity from morality has become the prevailing narrative. As the New York Times columnist Ben Smith put it, the racial reckoning in newsrooms represented an irreversible shift in mainstream American media, driven by a journalism that is more personal and reporters more willing to speak what they see as the truth without worrying about alienating conservatives. Worrying about alienating conservatives? 91% of the New York Times readership identifies Democrats. The ship of alienating conservatives sailed long ago. What this new form of journalism actually does is encourage journalists to come to a point of moral clarity before they start writing. In setting up an opposition between objectivity and moral clarity, this new journalism suggests reporters throw out the most important part of the labor of journalism, going into a story with an open mind, willing to learn and have your views changed by the people you interview, and replace it with the journalism in which reporters have already made up their minds that their subjects are racists, for example. Though this may not be the intention of those demanding we throw away objectivity, in effect what they are doing is telling young reporters who know nothing about the world to trust the knowledge imbued in them by their race or gender identity or sexuality, their lived experience, and declaim about the world from there, rather than go out and learn about the world and represent it to curious readers. What this means is that the Ivy League educated progeny of rich parents, the only people left who can afford to become journalists, are now being encouraged to define a nation from their own ridiculously circumscribed experiences, which reflect those of a tiny ruling elite. Is it any wonder so many Americans hate the media? As we have seen, the abandonment of objectivity in favor of a woke moral panic isn't really about representing Black people, but about pandering to white readers. It is they who are clicking on stories calling for defunding the police, a view rejected by 81% of Black respondents in a Gallup poll. It is they who answer the clarion call for open borders. It is white liberals for whom hundreds and hundreds of articles about white supremacy and slavery are written. Meanwhile, the legacy Black press remains relatively immune from these trends. If you go to the websites of the Chicago Defender and the Los Angeles Sentinel, you will find local coverage of Black businesses and social and political trends, but precious few articles about the dangers of white supremacy and the need to get rid of the police. For all its woke posturing, the New York Times was only able to secure the readership of 12% of Black Democrats in 2019 at the height of Donald Trump's reign, a 2020 Pew Research Center study found. Coming in at 3 times that number, with 36% of Black Democrats choosing it as a news source, is Fox News. But the Black press too struggles with the issue of class. Is the Black press reaching the lower class of African Americans? For most of Black America, that doesn't exist for them. They don't have the leisure time or inclination to be readers. Their time is taken up with making a living. Clint Wilson, author of Whither the Black Press, Glorious Past, Uncertain Future, and Emeritus Professor of Communication, Culture, and Media Studies at Howard University, explained. The lower classes have to have access to the platforms, but that's a problem because the average Black person is not reading Ta-Nehisi Coates. If we were talking about elevating lower class Blacks to the middle class, they're not reading the Wall Street Journal. They're probably not reading the Sentinel, so it's difficult. In other words, the Black press struggles with many of the same things as the mainstream press does, says Wilson. When one is trying to cover issues of race and class and economics, journalists, whether they be African American or white, will immediately go to a position that is consistent with the marketplace that they're catering to, that they're writing for. That is the basis of the economic sustainability of their particular medium. There actually is a problem concerning race and journalism in America, but that problem is not an overabundance of objectivity. It's that America's newsrooms remain crushingly and embarrassingly white, especially in the positions of leadership, and have proven stubbornly resistant to attempts to diversify. This is an absolute disaster, professionally as well as morally. According to Census Bureau data, while ethnic minorities make up 40% of Americans, they constitute just 17% of newsroom staff and 13% of newspaper leadership. Diversification efforts all too frequently relegate journalists of color to the softer sections of newspapers, culture, hot takes on the news, or entertainment, arts, and lifestyle, or to the online versions of legacy media. It's shameful. Just as it is a problem that the people tasked with telling the American story don't report on the lives of everyday Americans, erasing huge portions of American life from their pages and airwaves, it is also a problem that they don't themselves reflect America's racial diversity. And yet, the enduring whiteness of America's newsrooms stems more from the enduring whiteness of America's rich than it does from the enduring racism of America's journalists. As we have seen, being rich is essentially a precondition for becoming a journalist in the 21st century. It is a sad fact of American life that there is a big racial wealth gap, one that is the most pronounced at the top of the income scale. I endorse the racial reckoning when it comes to hiring to the nth degree, a producer at WNYC told me. Because the reason why newsrooms are so white is because of these class barriers to getting into journalism. I could not have gotten into journalism if my parents didn't pay up front for a car for me when I graduated college. If you're going to get a job in journalism making $20,000, $30,000 a year, you needed a car. There was no other way to do it. You need an internship. WNYC has just started paying our interns. But at least in the first 10 to 15 years of my career, you needed an internship while in college, which you might be paying for, and you might also have to have a paying job during. And in addition to that, you need also to have an unpaid internship 3 days a week. Otherwise, you literally could never get a full-time job in journalism when you graduate. If I was funding my education and my parents weren't, if I had to pay for my living expenses, I could not have done the stipend internship that I did. If my parents weren't paying my rent over the summer, I couldn't have done the internship that probably paid $1,000 for the entire summer that got me bylines, which helped me get another internship my senior year, which then got me my first job. These barriers were evident. You have to be wealthy to get into this job from the start, which then makes so little. I was paid $30,000 for my first job. The memoirist Thomas Chatterton Williams, whose father is black and mother is white, had this same experience but in reverse. Not from a wealthy background. He says that if he hadn't gotten a fellowship to go to graduate school at NYU, he never could have afforded the $60,000 a year tuition. The fellowship included a stipend which allowed him to take an unpaid internship. At the internship and at every subsequent entry-level journalism job he got, everyone besides him was rich. And not only rich. Every other intern was actually the son or daughter of someone famous, Williams recalled. That really shocked me. These girls were walking around in Chanel and Dior and were living in Manhattan and supposedly were making $19,000 a year. That's not just a racial thing. Poor white people and even lower middle class white people are equally excluded from those internships. There is just no way to tease out the class barrier from the race barrier for getting into journalism. And it's not only a problem when it comes to journalism. One of the things that I think is so problematic about the way we talk about race is that whiteness is overlaid with an upper middle classness, Williams explained. So we talk about the whiteness of Vogue, but that whiteness wouldn't be recognizable to some of my extended family in California who voted for Trump. They wouldn't recognize any of that culture at Vogue or Condé Nast, and they also wouldn't be welcome in there. Meanwhile, the black interns he met while at Vogue were the children of black intellectuals and celebrities. In America, we can't talk about class, so we racialize class, Williams said. We use race as a way of avoiding these distinctions. But not everyone is avoiding this conversation. The conversation around race within the black community is much richer and deeper than the one woke white liberals are engaged in. In Chapter 7, we saw polling that indicated that black Americans are far less radical on issues of race than liberal whites. And though these poll results are recent, there's historical precedent for them. Take William Lloyd Garrison, one of the most important and brave abolitionists in the United States. Garrison lived with a bounty on his head for much of his life. His newspaper, The Liberator, advocated for an immediate end to slavery, and he faced down a lynch mob more than once for his writing. One of his avid readers was a formerly enslaved person who went by the name of Frederick Douglass. His paper took its place with me next to the Bible, Douglass wrote of The Liberator in his memoir, My Bondage and My Freedom. The two met at an abolitionist meeting in 1841 after Douglass stood up and described to the white crowd what it was like to live as someone else's property. It was a powerful address, and Garrison became his mentor, retaining Douglass as a representative of the American Anti-Slavery Society, publishing Douglass's work, encouraging his book, and sending him around the country to speak about the evils of slavery. But the two had a bitter falling out in 1847 over the United States Constitution. Garrison believed that the document was pro-slavery, the formal expression of a corrupt bargain made at the founding of the country, and that it was designed to protect slavery as a permanent feature of American life, writes Christopher Daly in Covering America. Douglass initially agreed, but by the time he published My Bondage and My Freedom, he no longer did. In fact, he'd become convinced of the opposite, that the Constitution of the United States not only contained no guarantees in favor of slavery, but on the contrary, it is in its letter and spirit an anti-slavery instrument demanding the abolition of slavery as a condition of its own existence as the supreme law of the land. By then, Douglass had his own newspaper, the North Star, and began to advocate for political tactics to end slavery, something Garrison could not abide. In 1851, Garrison withdrew the American Anti-Slavery Society's endorsement from Douglass's paper, and then he went further. He denounced Douglass in the pages of The Liberator and did not speak to him for another 20 years. A white abolitionist tried to deplatform Frederick Douglass, a formerly enslaved person, for disagreeing about whether the Constitution is inherently racist and whether peaceful means could be used to end slavery. Today, as in Douglass's day, the sides of our culture war over anti-racism are not clearly divided along racial lines, despite the fact that they are about race. It is white liberals who have been most eager to embrace wokeness, and many of their ideas are quite alien within the Black community. And a growing group of Black intellectuals are leading a counterculture to point this out. They include public intellectuals like John McWhorter, a professor of linguistics at Columbia University, Thomas Chatterton Williams, Camille Foster, co-founder of Freethink and co-host of the Fifth Column podcast, Chloe Valdery, founder of a startup called Theory of Enchantment, Shelby Steele, a senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, and his son Eli Steele, a filmmaker, Glenn Lowry, professor of social sciences at Brown University, and Coleman Hughes, a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and contributing editor at City Journal. In being anti-woke and having experienced being Black in America, though not all of them identify as Black, these public intellectuals scramble the racial lines we're asked to accept by the national liberal media, speaking up for many who are too afraid to voice their opinions, people of all races, and facing down the mob on their behalf. If I get canceled, Williams told me, I'll get canceled by a white anti-racist. I really believe that. It would be wrong to overstate the similarities between these thinkers. They are by no means a coherent group, and they disagree about many, if not most, topics. Foster is an anarcho-libertarian. Williams has left-wing politics, and McWhorter identifies as a liberal. Valdery founded a startup, whose board I sit on, that offers a curriculum of character-building spiritual solutions to overcoming adversity. Lowry and Steele are more conservative. What unites all of these people into an increasingly influential intelligentsia is their rejection of the racial essentialism they view as ascendant in our current moment, the idea that one must prioritize race over everything else to combat racism. Racial essentialism is very reductive and actually oppressive, Valdery told me. Ironically, it reduces us as individuals to our immutable characteristics, which is precisely what we were supposed to be fighting against. In his book Self-Portrait in Black and White, Williams chronicles his attempt to shed the designation Black altogether. In arguing for a post-racial society, Williams lays out what he views as the similarities between today's anti-racist worldview and that of the racists it is trying to excise from society. Woke anti-racism proceeds from the premise that race is real, if not biological, he writes, then socially constructed and therefore equally, if not more significant still, putting it in sync with toxic presumptions of white supremacism that would also like to insist on the fundamentality of racial difference. Working toward opposing conclusions, racists and many anti-racists alike eagerly reduce people to abstract color categories, all the while feeding off of and legitimizing each other, while any of us searching for gray areas and common ground get devoured twice. We can simultaneously resist bigotry and imagine a society that has outgrown the identities it preys on, he concludes. It is not lost on Williams that he is a man who has eschewed his identity as Black and now has new prominence, at least in part due to the fact that society still perceives him through that lens. What I reject is the biological insistence that Blackness is distinct from other forms of humanity, he told me. For me, it's a cultural tradition. It's a heritage. It's love of my father and the world he represents. It's some of the best artistic achievements that have come out of America. It's a discipline, as Ralph Ellison said. It means that you are a part of a specific group of people in America who descended from slavery. Moreover, Williams in no way denies that racism exists. In his first book, Losing My Cool, Love, Literature, and a Black Man's Escape from the Crowd, he chillingly describes a horrible act of police brutality in which two of his brother Clarence's teeth were knocked out by two cops inside the garage of his family's home. When his pappy told him what had happened, it was only the second time he had heard his father cry. But the experience did not hit him and his brother Clarence in the same way. This experience hurt and infuriated Clarence, Williams writes. But he told me that it never diminished his self-confidence or led him to conclude that as a black man, this must be it. The truth here, the hard, inequitable truth, is that Clarence and I actually are freer than Pappy. Though we experience racism, sometimes even violently, it simply fails to define us as it might have had we been born just 2 or 3 decades sooner. He brings a similarly nuanced approach to bear on our current moment. Certainly, we have a police brutality problem, and certainly there's racism, and certainly that impacts blacks disproportionately. But we also have a police brutality problem that kills enormous amounts of whites, Native Americans, and Latinos, Williams told me. Oftentimes we get into this confused conversation where we make class differences, racial differences. We don't really take into account all the very different kind of textures in black life that exist now. Many black people have no contact with the criminal justice system, Williams says, while some white people killed by the police get very little attention. They include Tony Timpa, a white man who died in Dallas when police officers handcuffed him and pinned him to the ground and joked around over his dying body for 13 minutes. Overplaying the racial element not only hinders reforms that would work, Williams argued, it also fuels a dangerous cultural overreach. I'm 100% supportive of what the movement for Black Lives has done to raise awareness about police violence, and I hope it gets to some real reforms, he told me. But the excesses are really worth dwelling on. Those excesses include people losing jobs and a chilling of debate. The worst thing is you don't even allow yourself to think or say things, Williams says. Not many people have to be punished for this self-regulation to take effect. I see that happening already. His inbox is full of letters from people who are afraid to voice their opinions. For filmmaker Eli Steele, the emphasis on race is having a dehumanizing effect. Steele has what in woke circles would be called an intersectional identity. He's black, Jewish, and deaf, living life from more than one place of marginalization as the theory would have it. But Steele believes that's just a false way to claim power. Why are you putting labels on people? What purpose is that serving? When you feel the need to label somebody, you're doing it for a reason, he told me. As he explained, I was just reading today they're taking Cubans in Florida and moving them over to the white category. Who has the power to do that? That tells you there's a shift in the culture. And that shift has to do with power. If there was no power behind it, we wouldn't do it. This is where critical race theory gets into trouble. Whether they understand it or not, they are picking up the very same tools that white supremacists use. In today's society, it's in the academic world, the corporate world. But you have to remember that you are reducing people to bodies. You're reducing people to their names. You're reducing people to their skin color. Why are we doing this to society? We're in an age where you look past someone's humanity to their literal color, where you're ignoring the humanity, Steele said. Why do you have a system that does that? Why are you walking around with all that power? Steele's third film, What Killed Michael Brown, stars his father, the famous black conservative Shelby Steele. In it, Steele and Steele go to Ferguson, Missouri over and over again, trying to figure out how an 18-year-old black boy ended up fatally shot by a white police officer, and why, despite the fact that the Department of Justice concluded that the police officer shot Brown in self-defense, a narrative prevails in which he was killed out of racism while his hands were in the air. In trying to answer this question, father and son paint a damning portrait of American liberalism, in which white guilt became black power. Of course, there was a catch, Shelby Steele says in the film. To milk white guilt, we had to always be the victims of white racism. The film is a scathing critique of liberalism that undermines the central claims of critical race theory. America's original sin is not slavery, the elder Steele says in it. It is simply the use of race as a means to power. In other words, critical race theory is still committing this original sin. The film almost never made it to audiences. In an email, an Amazon representative informed Steele that What Killed Michael Brown did not meet the company's content quality expectations and was not eligible for publishing on the service. 8 days later, the platform relented, saying the letter had been sent in error. There's a shift in the culture, Eli Steele told me, and that shift has to do with power. If there was no power behind it, we wouldn't do it. Growing up, blackness meant power through strength, he explained. We were oppressed people, but we were overcoming. It was all about triumph. My uncles, not related, but my black uncles, they were doctors, they were filmmakers. Even the Holocaust survivors I grew up with had that aspiration. Now it's different. It's more about grievances, about victimization. Camille Foster was born in Washington, D.C. His mother is Jamaican. His stepfather was born here and was in high school when Brown v. Board of Education forced schools to desegregate. Foster grew up with two different models and two different understandings of what blackness means. It resulted in a kind of racial fluidity. Today he identifies as racially agnostic, which is to say he doesn't self-identify as black at all. I find, both because of the biological and genetic imprecision of race, but even more so because of the fraught contemporary issues that we have with respect to race and the really nasty history of the concept, that I would prefer not to engage with it at all, he explained to me. I live at a time in history in a country where my race simply is not a persistent hindrance to me. My phenotypic traits don't prevent me from gaining access to any place that I actually want to go. I'm not interested in going to a neo-Nazi meeting or a Klan meeting, and just like most sensible Americans, I wouldn't actually want to be a member of a white-only golf club. Foster's decision not to identify as black is a radical insistence on his right to define himself, to live an unqualified life on his own terms. None of this is to say that Foster is naive about police brutality, a subject he cares about deeply. But he worries that the lens of racism might be clouding, rather than clarifying, the solutions that would put an end to police violence, mass incarceration, and even the racial income gap. In other words, there is a cost that comes with a false positive, with identifying something as racist when it's not. And that cost is not just felt in the solutions it obfuscates, but on a personal level. The way Foster explained it, if he has a negative interaction with someone that is rooted in racism, but he chooses to see it as non-racial, he's lost nothing. But if he has a negative interaction that wasn't racist, and he imposes a racial filter on it, he has lost a piece of his humanity. To illustrate the point, he quoted from James Baldwin's seminal book, The Fire Next Time, in which Baldwin writes that because of the brutality white America metes out against black Americans, every black American risks having the gates of paranoia close on him in a society that is entirely hostile and by its nature seems determined to cut you down, that has cut down so many in the past and cuts down so many every day. It begins to be almost impossible to distinguish a real from a fancied injury. Here's how Foster put it. I think conditioning yourself to believe that the whole of the country or the whole of a particular race are at all times and in general disposed to think about you as a racial entity as opposed to as a human, as an individual, I think that's probably to your disadvantage. The whole discourse of white privilege is similarly insulting, Foster argued. It robs him of his ability to be an individual in a way that is presumptuous and dehumanizing. As he explained, in the current moment, everywhere I look, I see these signs that say Black Lives Matter, and I see Brooklynites who have scrawled the same slogan on their t-shirt with a Sharpie or something like that. And it's hard for me to see that. These people who are obviously motivated by good and conceive a sort of injustice and imagine that there's something they can do about it. But the slogan actually suggests that when they see me, they imagine me as somehow disabled, as somehow disadvantaged. They imagine themselves as superior to me, whether or not they conceptualize it in that way. They are privileged, and I am not. And nothing could be further from the truth. What's interesting about it is that we're further away from segregation and slavery than ever before, Eli Steele told me. Racism on almost every metric is lower. However, blacks and a lot of minorities are on the bottom of almost every socioeconomic measure. It might be racism, in some cases, yes, maybe, But critical race theory makes everything about race. That's where the power grab comes in. Of course, there are those who don't see it this way. For some activists and journalists, this is what progress looks like. I am less worried about an overcorrection right now than I am of a resettling of the status quo, Isaac J. Bailey, a journalist and a professor of public policy at Davidson University, told me. It does not mean that is the only thing or that it is the most important thing, he said of race. Rather, we recognize that it is still an important factor that actually touches all of us in different ways. The anti-racists are trying to de-center whiteness, Bailey explained. The goal is not to impose a uniformity of opinion, but to get people to do some soul searching and to recognize when they are having dangerous thoughts that could result in harming people of color. Bailey was raised in poverty in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. At the age of 9, he developed a severe stutter in response to his brother Moochie going to prison for killing a white man. Bailey's memoir, My Brother Moochie, Regaining Dignity in the Face of Crime, Poverty, and Racism in the American South, is his devastating attempt to grapple with the survivor's guilt of making it, while Moochie and later 2 of his younger brothers went to prison. The book catalogs Bailey's journey learning to reject the dichotomy often presented in America between good black people and those who get caught up in the criminal justice system. But it was Bailey's experience in being made to feel that he was a lesser human because of his stutter, first by children who mocked him, then by well-meaning adults who suggested he try to fix it, that made him reevaluate how to think about race. When I think of this goal of colorblindness, I actually see the same flaw, starting off from this premise that there is something wrong with acknowledging race. And I don't think there's anything wrong with acknowledging race, he said. It's how we treat each other based on that acknowledgement that's the real issue. In other words, you don't have to get rid of race to get rid of racism. For Bailey, blackness is a shared culture, an amorphous kinship created by a common struggle. And that struggle exists whether you choose to identify as black or not because it is imposed on you by a racist society. That American society is finally showing signs of listening to marginalized communities is progress, Bailey believes. Progress he's scared will evaporate. Suddenly, all these other voices which have long been silenced are finally being heard. Now is when you say things have gone too far because you don't like the way they are using their newfound voice, he said of the anti-woke current. Our time should be spent more on making sure that real long-lasting change comes out of this moment than on anything else right now. This vibrant debate between black thinkers, writers, intellectuals, and artists reflects the conversation within black families and communities across the nation, where people talk about race with a diversity and depth that white people who consider themselves woke simply cannot fathom. A lot of this is so different from what that white woke college professor would think these conversations would be, John McWhorter, a professor of linguistics at Columbia University, told me. They don't know that you can just sit and listen to uncle or cousin whoever, who really sounds much more like Glenn Lowry and me and Thomas Chatterton Williams and Coleman Hughes than you might think. And I don't think that they are rare. It's not weird Uncle Buster sitting over in the corner spouting off all this conservative stuff. It's most of the room. And the fact that the conversation about race we're having now at the national level is so divorced from the reality in black homes is a problem. The center should be what most black people around the country feel, which is that racism exists, but it's not everything. And often black people's problems are something other than how their white middle manager happens to feel about them, McWhorter went on. That's a very narrow, sclerotic view of what a human being thinks of as the world and their relation to it. In other words, while the black community is engaged in a rich, vibrant debate about race, this is simply not reflected in the vigorously enforced monoculture that's taken over the white elite press, purportedly on behalf of minorities. Those minority communities are having much more sophisticated debates among themselves about questions of race and class, debates that are impossible to fathom in the liberal mainstream press where the mission creep of what counts as racist has expanded beyond all proportion. Hard work is racist, that's what white people say, Thomas Chatterton Williams told me. But he said, you don't hear black people say hard work is racist. My first book was a criticism of the glorification of street culture through hip-hop. When I would do that talk, I never had more support than when I talked to an all-black audience, especially one that wasn't in an elite Ivy League space. If I went to North Carolina and talked to a room of 100 black professionals, they were enthusiastically supporting my message. Kendi might say that's because they've internalized racism and white supremacy, but that's patronizing. These are people who see dignity in taking your life and moving up and working hard. To me, that idea is so inherent in the idea of blackness that it's shocking what I see on Twitter as a representation of the way we should think about black people. There's a sublimated racism in wokeness, Williams argues. There's a way that white liberals can still indulge feelings of superiority, feelings of specialness, as if all evil comes from them, he said. They're special that way too. They have to help black people because black people are lower. There's even a kind of straight-up racism. It really is on that level. I don't think that's everybody's motivation, but that's part of it.
And that was Chapter 9, A Rich Debate Within the Black Community. From Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy by Batya Ungar Sargon. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.